40% of the SaaS companies in US have hired talent from India in one form or another.
And people who come from like the big FAANG companies, if that's been your entire career, is you don't really necessarily know how to hire at a startup.
In my journey of building companies, I found that hiring right people at the right time is the most complex challenge. So lately, I have built my passion to solve this complex problem.
So I ended up leaving the world of academics to start that company. I ended up, raising around $5 million over the course of that journey.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Sean. Hi, I'm Jaimin. I'm founder and CEO at Applers. In my journey of building companies, I found that hiring right people at the right time is the most complex challenge. So lately, I have built my passion to solve this complex problem, and that's what we solve at Applers, right? We are on a mission to help global SaaS product companies, whether scale up or startups, to hire and build their engineering team in India. Uh, they say that hiring from India is like finding needle from haystack, and that's the exact problem we are passionate to solve for. The objective of this podcast, which with love we call Hieroscope, is to bring on table experience and insights from various industry leaders who have solved massive industry problems, built great companies, and have tackled big challenge of hiring right people on the way. So for our first episode, I'm thrilled to have Sean. Sean has amazing journey, right? 25 years. Started in software development, was in PhD, built his company in HR tech, played leadership role in Google, and later he found his love for marketing. What a dynamic journey, right, Sean? You have built and lead teams, you have made successful businesses, you have created thriving communities, and you are also, running very popular podcast around software and technology. So, Sean, welcome, and would love to hear a bit more about your journey from you firsthand, and also a little bit about Skyflow, what you guys are building, what problem you guys are solving.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. When you say it like that, it's been 25 years. It makes me feel older than I want to recognize or acknowledge. But yeah, I mean, it's been a great journey. I've always loved technology since I was a kid. I first sort of got into programming when I was in high school and like ripping apart computers. And I think it was sort of, I always feel like I was sort of like really fortunate that I went to high school in the like 90s when the internet, the home computer, Windows 95, all these sorts of things were starting to happen. And it just, and growing up in a small town in rural Canada, to suddenly be able to be connected to all these places and look up anything, it just like transformed my world. And I became like really obsessed. And it led me on this journey where I went and studied computer science for a decade, where, I did 3 degrees in computer science. I was on this path of becoming a professor, professional researcher. And that's really what I wanted to do for a long time. But I eventually ended up, getting a postdoc at Stanford University, which in these, I had always wanted to go to like one of the best places, schools in the world. And I achieved that. But then I think when I was actually in it, I realized that maybe I was less sort of passionate about it than I originally thought. And I ended up met up with some other students, started a company on the side, and I found I was a lot more passionate about actually building technology and getting that in the hands of people in the real world, rather than necessarily doing sort of research where it might not see the light of day in some sort of practical sense for a really long time. And the best I could offer the world was maybe 6 people actually cared about the thing that I was, researching. So I ended up leaving the world of academics to start that company. I ended up, raising around $5 million over the course of that journey. I ran the company for 7 years. and then we ended up selling the company. It wasn't I'm not on a yacht with on this podcast or anything like that, but it was an amazing journey, and I learned a ton from that, and I think that kind of set me up to do other things other than just purely being an engineer. Because as a founder, you just have to wear so many hats. Like you're doing everything from the marketing plan to product to building sales organizations to taking out the garbage all in like a single day all the time. And then I ended up joining Google, had a great time there for 4 years. But ultimately, after 4 years, I felt sort of the pull back to the world of startups and being a little bit more earlier stage and having sort of be at that sort of company strategy level. So I ended up joining Skyflow almost 3 years ago now, and that's been a wonderful journey, and I've been really really excited to be part of it.
Oh, super, super. Let's deep dive a bit more on what was your startup? What problem you were solving?
Yeah, so it went through a few different iterations, of course, as many companies do, but we were always really focused on trying to build technology for what we felt was like a traditionally underserved market in the United States, where there's a lot of technology tools for hiring and finding jobs or recruiting people, taking people through a hiring process for kind of like college educated white collar jobs. If you're an engineer, there's like no shortage of tools that are built for you. But if you work in the restaurant industry or you're a construction worker or something like that, there's not that much tech built for you. And that was kind of what we were interested in trying to do. Originally, that started out with trying to modernize temp labor for blue collar jobs in the United States. So there's these staffing agencies that exist that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and mostly runs on kind of 1970s technology. And we were trying to bring modern technology to that more. At the time, it was sort of like mobile phones, but not the way we know mobile phones now, because this was like 2009, 2010. So there were smartphones, but they weren't as dominant. Not everybody had them. A lot of people had feature phones. So we did a lot of sort of text-based job placement and stuff like that. And then that eventually evolved into more permanent hires focused on restaurant industry, hospitality, high turnover positions, and with a very heavy mobile focus. So we were the first company to really build a full end-to-end hiring experience for both employers and candidates on a mobile device. So originally it was text messaging, and then that went into iOS, iPhone apps and Android apps, and we got featured by both Apple and Google, and got some nice traction and growth from that. And eventually we got to a place where we were cash flow positive, but we were able to kind of break through and really become like the rocket ship that we had hoped to become.
Interesting. And Sean, in that journey, as a startup founder, as you would be wearing multiple hats, right? As you mentioned, you need to take care of everything. But what were your top three big areas to take care of? Top three challenges to focus upon?
So I really oversaw product engineering and marketing, and I think the engineering aspect came sort of natural to me because that was like what my training was. I think. Even product, I think, was something that came relatively natural given my research background, because a lot of, I think, developing products is connecting with who your customer and consumer is, understanding their pain point. And I'd done a lot of that throughout my PhD work. And that was really how we were able to, I think, get to a place where we had a product that had product market fit and people were willing to pay for it. We just went out and we would take meetings with anybody that was willing to meet with us, and we would talk to them about how they hire. We would get them to show us how they do that today and just interview them essentially. And we would get inspired from those, customer interviews essentially. And we go build low fidelity prototypes, bring that back and ask people what they thought of it. And eventually we got something where they were willing to try it. And then eventually from there, that led to something that they're willing to pay for. And then now that's great. That's one way to get, your first 10 customers, but how do you go from 10 to 100 to 1,000, especially for something where, the price point of our software was low, like the lifetime value of the customer was not that high. So you need lots of them. And so then you have to figure out go to market. And that's where sort of the marketing part came from. And I think that's the area that took us the longest to figure out, because what happens a lot of times with companies that have tried to sort of bring technology to this market of like SMB hiring lower cost positions where people are maybe getting paid like minimum wage, and they survive mostly on tips, and they're super high turnover, is a lot of companies that go in with the best intentions, they end up abandoning that and going up market because it's really, really hard to do in a way that's scalable and
Mhm.
cost efficient. Your lifetime value to your CAC ratio just gets super out of balance. So a lot of things that maybe work when you're placing people who are going to earn, six-figure salaries, they don't work when you're trying to place somebody who's going to make $10 an hour. It
Oh,
just doesn't, because you can't pay, salespeople or like recruiters to fill those jobs. So you have
yeah.
to figure out a way to scale that for really low cost. And that took us a long time to figure that out. And when we did, and basically the way we did that was all through like SEO and content marketing. And that's
Oh,
kind of where I like cut my teeth on marketing. And it
mm.
was mostly because there was no one else to do it. Like if it's like you either figure this out or you die as a business. So nothing creates a sense of urgency like the risk of like complete failure
No.
and losing all your investors' money. So we had to figure it out, and it took a lot of grinding. And I think some of the advantage that I had was, given my sort of academic background, I'm kind of used to diving in, head first into areas that are like large, ambiguous problems that I may not have that much experience with,
Mhm.
but I can just, I can go deep and dive and then sort of try to solve that from first principles and learn. And I had a lot of experience from that, just from 10 years of university. So I was able to dive into it and just like learn from experts in the industry, read and listen to a ton of stuff, take courses, and figure out something through experimentation that was working for us. And that's how we were able to grow and get the cash flow positive. I think the downside of that was we got to that place fairly late in our journey where we sort of ran out of at bats for really fundraising without significant growth to
Mhm.
show.
Mhm.
So that's where we got to a place where we were making money. We had a growing business, but it was slow growing. But we didn't have sort of the financial resources or the war chest to pour more cash in to really amplify it. So that's
Mhm.
why where we ended up, deciding to go through an acquisition to move on and sort of help scale that business.
Interesting, interesting. So that's where you kind of that was your first interaction to marketing, and now you are heading marketing at Skyflow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Let's deep dive a bit more into Skyflow. What problems you
Mhm.
guys are solving here?
Yeah. So the problem that we're really focused on is around um, essentially data protection for sensitive customer data. So we are a data privacy vault company, and essentially what a data privacy vault is it gives you isolation, protection, and governance over sensitive customer data. And in the same way that we've recognized over time that there's different classes of data, especially when it comes to sensitive data. So we have things like encryption keys, and we have secrets, and we have passwords. And each of those over the last decade have had specialized technology developed for handling them, so that
Mhm.
you can balance sort of the security and the utility of those things. So I don't have to, as an engineer, be responsible for figuring out how to securely store passwords.
Mhm.
I can go and use an identity provider and offload that to someone who's an expert in it and use that as a service. Or for secrets, I can go and use like a secrets manager. I don't have to essentially take on the responsibility of figuring out how do I keep these secrets protected in an environment file or in my source code. But no one has really done that for customer data.
Mhm.
And that's essentially what a data privacy vault gives you. Is it's a specialized technology for securing the data and also essentially making it usable in a way that protects you from the responsibility of sort of having to protect and use it yourself. And this is essentially a way to get like Google level security infrastructure, but available as a service is the way I think of it for Skyflow. And we took inspiration from some companies that had kind of independently come to this sort of architectural pattern, but they built it internally for their own businesses. And we were the first company to really take that idea and build it as a service
Democratize
for
it.
everyone else.
Interesting. And I think
Mhm.
a lot of use case, especially in the age of AI and ML, where a
Yeah.
lot of data stumbles between multiple systems. Great, great, super. Great, Sean. So great to hear, story about, your startup, what, your current company does, your journey from engineering to marketing and everything in between.
Hmm.
Today we are going to kind of deep dive and cover a couple of umbrella aspects, right? First is about hiring, which we at Applers love. You have you know extensive experience in hiring, both in massive ecosystem like Google and also in startups. Plus, you have experience hiring in US, globally, including India. So we would love to deep dive a bit into that and understand, your mantras of hiring, building the team, managing people. And the second aspect we'll go deep is in AI, right? You are very close to the AI ecosystem, speaks a lot about ML, AI, LLMs. I can see that on your podcast. We at Applers are kind of extensively into leveraging AI in hiring and recruitment space, doing a lot of
Hmm.
trials, have some successes, learning in others. But that's another area we'll cover where I'll also share across what we are doing at Applers and how we are seeing AI can kind of transform hiring as a process, right? First, let's start with hiring, right? Uh, Sean, shed some lights on hiring aspect when it comes to hiring at large company like Google
Hmm.
versus a startup, a SaaS product company. What are the different environments? What is the landscape? What is the mindset? What are the differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very, very different. And I think sort of the knock typically on people who come from like the big fan companies, if that's been your entire career, is you don't really necessarily know how to hire at a startup. And like based on my experience, I could see how that could become a problem because when you work for a place like Google and you're hiring manager, you don't have to create like your own hiring pipeline. Like this whole thing is a machine. So it's like I got a job rack, I got approval for headcount. I turn a knob, and then there's like a flood of candidates from like really great places, all eagerly, showing up. And that's not what is the experience at a startup because if you, especially if you're earlier stage, and maybe people don't know who you are, they're not flooding at the gates to essentially come to you. So I would also say, in a place like Google, because it's this machine and they're doing it at such scale, it's very sort of, they try to make it as quantitative as possible.
Mhm.
And I think some of the really good things that come out of that experience is you have, in order to interview people at Google, even if you're not a hiring manager, like anybody can interview people, you have to go through training. So I do think that is really good from the perspective of like they're actually doing some work to make you good at interviewing, and that's
Mhm.
a skill set that I think a lot of people assume that they have because they're like, well, I got hired and I've been interviewed places, so I must be good at interviewing. But it is a new skill set. You have to like learn how to interview people and learn like you know I think like one of the things people a lot of times do is it's a lot more sort of like gut based,
Mhm.
and they don't really have more of a like an approach where they're asking the same questions each time and getting a gauge for like what a great candidate looks like versus like an okay candidate, or even reflecting on people they've hired previously and trying to map that to the types of questions they asked and why did they make a mistake in a hiring, because that's something they could have prevented, whereas Google spends a lot of time, like they have entire teams dedicated to just figuring that kind of stuff out. So there's a big change there, and I think in terms of the actual experience as well as like a hiring manager, like at Google, I think there's a lot of focus on nurturing and developing talent.
Mhm.
So you can kind of take time to invest in somebody who's maybe a little bit raw because they're fresh from university. And it's okay that it's going to take 2 years for that person to be like really, really good. In a startup, you don't generally have that kind of time. Like it's a lot more focused on how do you get some, everybody has to have impact almost from like day one. So it does change the lens with which you're evaluating people. Because you just don't have time to like really nurture talent in the same way at a startup. Like you have to develop the skill of being able to recruit and generate your own pipeline. Even if you have recruiters, I think a lot of the times it's more meaningful if you're a manager reaching out to a candidate than them hearing from a recruiter, because it's just going to feel more personal. They're hearing from the person who actually wants to talk to them or is interested in hiring them versus like going through a proxy.
Mhm.
Um, and I think in terms of evaluation, it's a little bit different as well, where you still need to test people's skills, but there's also, you have to figure out, is this person really a fit for a startup? They need to have the personality where there's a lot more ambiguity. There's a lot less figured out in a startup a lot of times. And not everybody's okay with that. If you go to a big established public company, and you have something that happens, like you have some sort of medical issue, or you need to take like leave for maternity or paternity leave, like all those systems exist. If you're a small scale startup, you might be the first person ever in the history of that company that's ever done this, and they're figuring it out on the fly, and that kind of stuff happens all the time. So you kind of have to be okay, like building the plane while you're flying it, both from the product go to market sense, but also just in terms of like the operations of the business and day to day.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, so hiring for startup is a completely different ball game, right? I speak with a lot of companies, both at large companies and startup, and what I uh, you know understood is that the hiring problem in startup starts at top of the funnel, starting from attracting the right talent. Googles
Yeah.
of the world don't have that problem, right? For them, it is just the bottom of the funnel. I think they attract talents like magnet. Let's go a little bit deep into some of these areas. Very interesting aspects you shared. You mentioned about Google trains people how to hire. So hiring is also a skill, right?
Mhm.
And a very important skill as a founder, especially in a startup, because I think the people you hire, that those people are going to build the culture of the company, and they would build the company. What kind of training, or what are those top 2 3 learnings you remember,
Mhm.
which you got from trainings at Google, which you are kind of implementing in your further hiring in
Yeah. So yeah, so they do. So I mean, they take you through a lot of the like process of like what sort of the end to end interview process is at Google. Like, how do hiring decisions get made? How does that get weighed in? How does each individual interviewer like contribute to that?
Mhm,
And then they also go through like, they have essentially rubrics set up for every like level of person for specific like role that they're hiring into. It's
mhm,
pretty hard to do something like that at a startup,
mhm,
and it's probably an unreasonable thing to do as well.
mhm,
Like, they have it really down to kind of like a science, where you're trying to map like signals that you're seeing in the interview process to signals that have been figured out in terms of like, how do I appropriately like level this person's skills.
mhm,
But there is value in that, even when it comes time to be hiring at a startup, just sort of that quantitative approach. And also, I think some of the skills they teach you is around like consistency, like asking the same series of questions so that you can build up a rhythm for understanding when you're seeing someone who's like truly talented and like really doing well with a question, versus like they're okay, versus like, no, this person's probably not at the bar or level that we need.
mhm,
um, and then before you're able to interview anybody officially, you also have to shadow existing interviews. So
mhm,
you listen in, and then you evaluate that candidate as if you were interviewing them. So you
mhm.
write up the whole evaluation, you take notes and everything, and then you have to submit that. And then someone basically grades your performance in terms of evaluating that person. And they're trying to get a sense for, um, did you it, are you essentially correctly assessing a candidate's skills based on an experienced interviewer. And you have to do that multiple times before they like release you to interviewing people.
Very interesting, very interesting. And certainly startups don't have this luxury, right? Hey, you are
Yeah,
always on fire.
exactly. And I think there's a lot of focus on like writing very comprehensive notes. Like, I think one of the other things that was really valuable from that experience, and is valuable at a startup as well, is thinking through, um, essentially trying to justify your assessment of a candidate with evidence.
Mhm,
So rather than just saying like, I think this person's really good, we should definitely hire them, like, you have to justify those decisions. Like, if you say someone was good problem solver, like, that's not the end of it. You have to provide evidence for what happened in the interview to give you the signal that they're a good problem solver. So I think that is really helpful, because it has more of sort of like a science behind it, and it forces you to think through like your actual assessment. Like, because if you say like, oh, this person was a good problem solver, And then you start to think, okay, well, what evidence actually led me to think that? And then you think back through your notes or you think through the interview and you're like, actually, there wasn't really, that didn't really happen. Like that was my, impression or something like that based because I like the person for whatever, but I don't actually have evidence of it. So either you need to adjust your questions that you ask because you didn't ask a question that actually allows you to assess that skill, or the candidate didn't actually show enough evidence based on the questions that you're asking that they were good at that skill. So I think that's really the valuable skill set that I think comes out of that training that you can apply anywhere.
Very interesting. It's all about making it more and more objective and taking
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that gut and emotion out of it. And any other learning which can really help in startup hiring.
What I think in a startup, like one of the things that's different than at a place like Google is at a startup, they're so mission driven.
Hmm.
Presumably you want everybody to be really motivated to be there and believe in the vision of the company, and that's why you're maybe willing to, take a lower salary and bet on the company and all these types of things, right? So I think you have to be able to test people's to the best of your ability, like sort of their grit and passion for it, and like why they really want to be there.
Hmm.
And typically at a place like Google, they're less focused on that because people come to that company for a variety of different reasons, and it's going to be less about the mission when you have 150,000 full time employees than when you have 15. So you need to, in so much of at a startup, I think too is being able to basically walk through a wall if that's what it takes to be successful, and that just comes with grit because there's inevitably going to be a lot of ups and downs. And you need a certain level of like resilience to be okay with that, and sometimes stuff that you invested considerable amount of time might be thrown out because it doesn't make sense for the business, or you find out that no one wanted that thing, and you have to kind of be okay with throwing that away and moving on to the next project and stuff. So there's a lot of like resilience involved. It's a hard thing to test. I think that's like one of the hardest things to figure out in an interview is, does someone sort of have that resilience and grit? Like one of the things I've started asking people about is trying to get stories about what are they really passionate about? And it doesn't even, or like obsessed about, like, when have they obsessed about a problem to the point where they just like couldn't stop, like, trying to figure it out. And I think like trying to dig into those stories and ask questions, like, and it's not just like listen to the story, you need to ask like the second level questions, like get into the details. And I think really good candidates, one, you can kind of see their enthusiasm for the problem and that they worked on during the course of them talking about it, and they can share like really, really like detailed reports about like that experience because they were in it and like living it. And that's kind of like what you need to be able to be really effective at a startup, is that kind of like passion and drive to figure out how to solve problems.
Very interesting. But these things are not very easy to gauge, right? I speak with a lot of startup founders, and I think many of them come from engineering technical background, and I think this is kind of a big mystery in many cases, right? That hey,
Yeah.
startups know that we need people who are passionate about the problems we are solving, who are good at solving problem. Resilience is one of the big piece you said. Collaboration should work as a team. But take full ownership, passionate about it. But then how to gauge in an interview, right? Because you typically get what, 2 hours, 3 hours time, and in that also, majority of the time you spend behind gauging technical skills, because that is also equally important. I have heard many times that startups don't hire for skill set; they hire for mindset. Skill sets are easy to gauge. There are many tools available: Codility, HackerRank, technology available to gauge technical skills. But the other aspect, the will part, apart from skill,
Yeah.
is a tough cookie to crack. Let's go a bit deeper into that, Sean. How have you tried identifying these attributes? When you hire, where have you seen success, and possibly where you haven't?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, you're 100% correct. Like testing skill, especially for engineering, there, and you can agree, disagree about the best way to do that, but there are lots of ways of essentially testing someone's like skill for the job. It's a lot harder to test sort of like passion, grit, resiliency. But I think that there's some things that you can do. Like I mentioned, trying to dig into what was something that they like obsessed over. A lot of times I ask people around like what they feel, either like what was their project that they were most proud of, or what did they, what was the most impactful thing that they ever did, and try to understand also like why they think that was the most impactful, so you can get a gauge for what they consider to be good. And if it's something that's publicly available, you can even go, look at that thing. So if their gauge for what they think is like quality work is off from what you think is quality work, like that's helpful, because then you can see that there's, potentially a misalignment there. And you can also ask people about mistakes that made, like not what is your, like not the like classic sort of cliche questions around like what is your biggest weakness, or something like that. But you can tell a person about a time when, or get them to tell you about a time when they failed, whether they learned from it, and you can kind of test a little bit of resilience there. But you have to like dig into these kind of behavioral questions.
Mhm.
And I think the other thing that's helpful too with behavioral questions is don't always let people get away with like a single answer, especially if it's an important question. So if you're asking somebody about, tell me about a time when you failed at a project and what you learned from it, like they might have kind of one story like in their back pocket, ready to throw out there. But once they've done that, ask them for another example. Like see how far they can go, how deep they can go, so that you're not just getting sort of that canned answer, that practiced answer immediately. So these are some things that can help. I also think like panel interviews, or something where it's more about showcasing a project that you worked on, is
Mhm.
also really helpful. So if you've already sort of tested their skills, they're up to whatever bar that you think, then you can have them walk you through a project that they worked on previously. Or if they don't have something like that, you can give them a few things that they can do, like you give them a small test essentially, where they can go and work on their own time to put together a project and then present it. And that's also a good test for, I think, how truly interested and passionate somebody is. Because I think really good candidates that are probably going to do well at a startup see that as an opportunity to kind of show off what they can do.
Right.
And then people who are maybe not as good a fit see it as like, this is an inconvenience, and I'm going to do like the minimal amount of effort to like grind my way through this.
So yeah, and that's also a good indication of how interested they are in joining the startup, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Are you willing to put in a little bit of work to
true.
do that? And you can even work a little bit with them and stuff like that, and that gives you a
Yep.
chance to see like how do they collaborate and stuff.
Yep. 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 Interesting.
It's not 100%. I've had people like kill those interviews, and we think like, oh my god, this person's going to be amazing, and then they haven't worked out. I think failure is part of part of hiring, but I think the key there is you have to kind of reflect on those experiences and figure out like what mistakes did we make, if any. Are there things that adjustments that we need to make in the hiring process, and kind of try
Hmm.
to learn from it.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. And so I think the story doesn't end here, right? As a startup, which is an early stage startup, the market doesn't know the name yet. You found a great candidate, but then
Mm-hmm.
hey, probably you also need to kind of promote, sell your company for that person to join.
Yeah.
That is also a big part of the game, right? When you are hiring the top talent, you are competing with bigger companies who have bigger pockets, who have bigger brands.
Mm-hmm.
Some tips on that, because I also see that a lot of startups kind of also struggle in that area, that finding a really good talent and onboarding them
Mm-hmm.
are still two very different things, right? Because the
Yeah.
good talents have that choice, and they also select where they want to work for.
Yeah, I think to some extent, if you're in a senior position in a startup, and you're going to be hiring, even when you're not hiring, you kind of always need to be recruiting and like nurturing talent and building pipeline. So if you see somebody that has like interesting skills, even if you're not in necessarily a position to hire that person today, I think it's valuable to try to create a connection and relationship with that person.
Hmm.
Because then when you get into a place where you do have a position available, then you're some more of a known quantity, and you've already sort of nurtured that relationship.
Mhm.
So and I feel like a lot of people are open to having conversations, depending on how you sort of present that. I think a lot of times I reach out to folks, and just one is it's almost like being a really good like sales rep. You have to have sort of sales skills, so you need to like personalize your message. Coming from the actual person who's like in a leadership position is going to be more meaningful, and and just saying like, hey, like I really like what your experience, like personalize it, like actually read like their LinkedIn profile, understand who this person is, what drives them, and then also talk about like you don't have to be super verbose. Give them something like, hey, we're building something really interesting here. I would love to connect and just tell you about it, or see explore whether there's some mutual way that we might be able to work together. And I think a lot of people, like I have a pretty high success rate with getting those conversations started. And that's kind of the first stage, is like, can you get somebody to actually take a call with you? And
Mhm.
then when it comes to the call, like you have to be good at essentially like pitching and selling your business. You have to sell that vision. And if you can get people excited about the vision, that's a lot of times like half the battle.
Yeah, yeah. True, true, true. Yeah, I think it's a tough role to be a startup founder, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Let's have a quick rapid fire, right, and summarize our this conversation. So, Sean, what would be the top three tips you would like to give to startup founders who are kind of struggling to hire today?
So I think, like I just said, one is you kind of always need to be hiring. So you need to be, thinking about building that pipeline all the time. So always be trying to look for opportunities to just connect with people who are talented, have conversations with them. And you don't have to let it just have one conversation and then they never hear from you again. You should be, proactively trying to reach out to them, get a pulse for where they are in their careers, as well as where you are as a business. Because it could be that, at the given stage that you're at is too early, but if you're successful and you reach that next stage, then maybe that person's ready to make that jump at that point, and you can re-engage them and be like, and kind of come back like, hey, we had this conversation like a year ago. You felt like we were too early, but now this and this has happened. Would it be worth a second conversation? So I think that is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the other, in terms of once you get somebody sort of in the funnel and you're going through the interview process, is continually evaluating how you're actually interviewing and reflecting on where you've been successful, where you haven't been successful. What are some of the things that are consistent about the people who've been successful, to try to, just like when it comes to figuring out who your customer is, you want this like ideal customer profile, you want to build up a persona. You almost need to do the same thing when it comes to hiring. Like, what is sort of the ideal candidate profile? What are some of those like soft skills that are ultimately really important to your company to be successful? Like, what is that cohesive ingredient that everybody has? Um, and then I think the last thing is, you have to be, just as a founder has to be good at selling their company to in order to raise money.
Mm-hmm.
As a founder or an executive or hiring manager, you have to be good at selling the company and the vision in order to recruit top talent, because top talent are going to have choices, and they want to go behind the companies that they feel like are unbelievable, once in a lifetime opportunities. And I think if you're good at selling that vision, you can recruit really great people.
Super. Amazing. Amazing. I
Mm-hmm.
think good summary. Good summary in 1.5 minutes. Great. Let's jump to hiring from India. Right.
Mm-hmm.
In India is a very different ecosystem, talent ecosystem, when it comes to engineering. Uh, India has 6.5 million tech talent, a very massive ecosystem. In 2023, India became the largest, right, when it comes to technology talent in the world. In India, the talent landscape is divided into three broader landscape, and I think you would be aware about it. As you know, Skyflow, you guys have built your team in India. A majority of this talent ecosystem works with those service companies, integrators we call them. Like the talent ecosystem, there are three buckets.
Mm-hmm.
One is those IT service companies or so-called integrators, right? Cognizant, Capgemini, TCS, Wipro. uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you are aware, the TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, it
Yeah, yeah.
includes 600,000 employees in India. It's that massive, right? So
Yeah.
I think two-thirds of the talent ecosystem works in IT service companies. And
Hmm.
then the second bucket is about so-called global delivery centers, right? Where companies in US, UK, Australia, they set up their center in India. There are more than 3,000 global delivery centers in India. You name any company, right? Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, or even many small to medium sized companies. They have made India their home for their engineering centers and many for even back office.
Hmm.
Third ecosystem which has evolved amazingly well in last one decade is that startup ecosystem. Before a decade, India didn't have existence of that. In
Hmm.
last 10 years, because India is a massive consumer base, right, with 1.4 billion people, and then there are B2C and B2B startups are flourishing in India now. India is home to around 27,000 startups, and we have 100 unicorns, and which is growing massively at a fast pace. And there are some global companies, right, especially in SaaS, like Freshwork, Zoho, and MoEngage,
Yeah.
and a few more, who are kind of India-based company and then expanding into US. But what this third ecosystem has done is it has created that very driven, dynamic, innovative talent pool, because that's what the startup is all about. And we see that now, many of the global SaaS companies, product startups, like even Skyflow, are tapping into Indian talent ecosystem, and they typically look for talents who have worked in this product SaaS internet space.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, I was going through some numbers, and I heard somewhere that around 40% of the SaaS companies in US have hired talent from India in one form or another. Either they have hired remote teams or they have set up their center in Bangalore. But I'm attending SaaStar next week, and I
Hmm.
was I was going through the speaker list, and I asked my team, "Hey, we have that data set. Can you look at this 70 speakers and see whether their companies have teams in India or hired in India?" Guess how many of those companies would have teams in India, Sean?
I don't know. 90%.
I wish, right?
Yeah.
And one day it will be, but it was around 74%.
Okay. I mean, that's still a pretty impressive
Yeah,
number.
not that far, right?
Yeah.
But I was amazed to see that. Hey, I just took a very small subset and tried to kind of connect the dots with what information
Hmm.
I had from those broader report, and that's what we are excited about, right? Companies come to India mainly for two reasons. One is availability of quality talent. Again, in India, hiring a talent is a very different ball game compared to hiring in US or Europe. It's a kind of a large, massive market. So one is availability of talent, quality talent, and second is those cost benefits, because here the cost of living is much lower than other part of the world.
Yeah.
Uh, and you guys have experience of hiring in India. I think you hired your marketer before a couple of months in India, right?
Hmm.
But you have seen hiring engineers, even hiring marketers, and you are expanding your team in India. So let's go deep into that. Your experience into that space.
Hmm.
Let's start with what is the why for Skyflow? To expand team in India. Where
Hmm.
this thought started.
Yeah. So I think so. Both our founders are originally from India.
Yeah, yeah.
So so they obviously they have like connective tissue there. They both graduated from IIT, so they have a lot of network in India. And then our CTO, he kind of splits his time between US and India.
Okay.
So and I think what happened in part was during the when the pandemic hit, which was like a year after Skyflow was founded. The some of the engineering team that was from India wanted to essentially, they wanted to go back to India during the pandemic to be closer to family and so forth. And that ended up in a situation where we started hiring more engineering talent there. So now the majority of the engineering team is in India. And then, of course, if you have the majority engineering team there, you also need, product managers locally in the same time zone to help support them. And then as we expanded go to market, then we started hiring sales there, which then you also need other, functions like customer experience, now marketing and so forth to get essentially the full range. So probably maybe 40% of Skyflow, at least, is based in India
Mhm.
today. So that's kind of like the history there.
Okay, okay, interesting. That's what even we are seeing, right? That founders or even the people in leadership position who are from India, they because they understand the culture well, right? It is
Mhm.
easy for them to set up that offshore team and manage that. In your experience, Sean, I think you have closely observed hiring in India, setting up team in India. You have hired few people on your own.
Mhm.
As per your experience, what are the difference? When you hire someone in US versus India.
Yeah, so I think like one thing is everything in India is just bigger. Like, if you put up a job uh, for almost any position, you're gonna get flooded with like 400 applicants at least. It's crazy the volume of people that are applying, and not everybody's gonna be the a fit. Just like posting a job in the U.S., not everybody's going to be a fit, but there's some really talented people in there if you take the time to go through and look through it. So I think like that's one of the big differences is just like the sheer volume of people because the population is so big and there's so many people in technology and probably a lot of people who are eager to work for a US based company as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And then so there's tons of talent. I think that also helps from like a hiring diversity perspective. You're going to have different sort of points of view, different perspectives, different backgrounds, which I think is really valuable for a company,
Mhm.
especially as you're building products. And if you want to have a product, especially a SaaS offering that you're going to go global, is really important that you understand
Yes.
sort of different perspectives, right? Because
Yeah.
doing the U.S. playbook and the U.S. messaging in Europe or in different regions around the world isn't gonna work because people have different cultural perspectives on that. So I think that's really valuable. There are certain I found anyway certain types of roles that are harder to hire in India. Maybe just because they haven't had as much history. Like you did a really good job of sort of framing these sort of three buckets in technology sector, and there's certain I think roles that are have less history in India, so it's harder to find people. There are those people. It's just there's less volume of them. So I think certain things like product marketing,
Mhm.
is a little bit more challenging to find somebody that's like really experienced in that role. Certain creative positions as well, like a creative director. These are
Mhm.
kind of like brand specialists. Like these are very marketing focused roles.
Mhm.
But engineering talent, there's a plethora of. I do think that in terms of there are differences too in terms of interacting with employees from India. In my experience, from maybe a U.S. based employee, and it just like I'm from Canada originally. I think interacting with Canadians is a little bit different than interacting with U.S. Citizens as well. But like a lot of times, in my experience, like communication can be often like less direct. There's a difference, and like more of a deference to authority um, from certain countries than there is in the U.S. I think U.S. inherently a lot of people have I don't know like resistance to authority in some sense. They want to challenge when they want to challenge their superiors, which sometimes can be good to a certain extent if you can, as long as you can do it in a respectful way.
Yeah.
I think like work ethic in my experience with hiring people in India is incredible. Like people work incredibly hard. That has never been an issue at all.
Yeah.
I think there's some differences in terms of appetite for risk as
Mhm.
well. I think U.S. is feels like inherently like a culture that um, likes to take risks, and I think that's why they've had such a history around startups. There's other things that feed into that, but some of the things about the U.S. culture that has lended well to like innovation and startups is this sort of fierce sense of like independence and wanting to like challenge the status quo. They
Mhm.
just have such a rich culture of that, which lends itself to I think more of a like a culture that takes risks.
Mhm.
And I've seen maybe there's like more of a risk aversion for certain people that you're certain candidates you might be hiring in India, which isn't necessarily bad. You just kind of need to know the landscape and what to expect.
And that is changing, but right. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in India, we did a survey before a few years that we kind of did survey to 5,000 talents in India, and it was simple questions, right? Hey, what is most important for you when you look for a job? And I think it was just post COVID, and we were anticipating that either higher pay, better work, or remote work would come among top three, and the topmost kind of attribute which came was safety and security of the job, right? So that safety mindset is there in India, but it is changing big time. Right now,
Mm-hmm.
we see that with all the startup ecosystem, a lot of funding coming in the market, people are changing that mindset, and I'm seeing that thought process and mindset changing rapidly in Indian talent ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and yeah, another point which you covered about that, had that communication style, right? It's not very direct. That you know authoritative way of kind of working, where does it work, where it doesn't work. We also kind of hired a cross culture consultant before a few years. She was from US, but she spent
Mm-hmm.
around 4 years in India, in one of the company, to kind of set up those cross culture bridges between both the team. And we recorded kind of a course. We created a course, one course for the companies who are hiring from India, and one course for the talent who are looking to join a global company, because both need to understand, right? No
Mm-hmm.
culture is right or wrong. At
Yeah.
the end of the day, culture is kind of the way people behave in a certain family, company, society, nation, and it has a lot of roots in the history, that how things have evolved. But interesting insight came, which is worth sharing in this conversation. That she plotted kind of culture or work culture of different countries into something called low context and high context. So
Mm-hmm.
low context culture are those where people rely on spoken or written words to communicate. It is very direct, right? Whatever you are thinking, you say, and whatever you say, you believe into that. Germany was on the far side of that culture, right? Very direct. And
Mm-hmm.
for example, all the Western countries, US, UK, were into that part of low context culture. Uh, then there is a high context culture, where in communication, people rely beyond just spoken words. What are interpersonal relationship? How my, what are the clues, body language, and that group where India falls, not the extreme, but
Mm-hmm.
India falls is a high context culture where the communication happens beyond just text and words, and right. And I think that
Yeah.
was the whole exercise which we did with her, is that, hey, how to identify ultimately, when a US company is working with their Indian team, what needs to be established is a bridge through which a work can be done effectively. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
was the whole exercise we did with her, which was amazing. We created a course, and now any talent which we kind of deploy in a US company, we make sure that that person goes through that course, and there is a 20-minute course for the person who is
Mm-hmm.
now going to manage team in India for the first time. It is all about asking more questions, creating that environment where people can speak up very openly, because uh, kind of, if you are not hearing no, ask three more times, because
Mm-hmm.
typically yes would come, and then you need to probe a little bit more to get clarity. But there are few tricks,
Yeah.
practices, I would say. If followed, we have seen this work amazingly well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, when you hired from India, uh, have you tweaked your recruitment process, recruitment stages? Have you made any differences?
So in terms of recruitment, I mean, we hired local recruiters,
Okay.
which is tremendously helpful because I think again, it's kind of like the things that maybe work for recruitment in the U.S. to attract talent aren't necessarily the same things that are going to work in India. And then additionally, someone who's in India, besides understanding maybe the cultural differences, is they also know which companies to hire from, where the talent is.
Mhm.
If you want to hire for engineering, like where should I go, or I want to hire for some other role, I should go after this companies. It's harder, I think, to know that as a US based recruiter. So those are some of the adjustments I would say that we made in terms of like the actual interview process. We haven't really made any tweaks there,
Mhm.
at least on my side of the coin. We haven't made any adjustments. And I think as I scale my own team in India, maybe we'll make changes there. But so far, it's been successful.
Okay. Okay. Super.
But
Super.
I do think like when you're talking about the high context, low context, I think that is really really valuable for people to understand because it's not that like you said like no culture is right or wrong. You just need to understand what the differences are so that you can make adjustments yourself if that is like a different style of communication. Like a friend of mine at Google, he has a very large team based in India, and I know and he had been trained sort of in this high context, low context stuff as well. And one of the adjustments he made when he does a lot of training with the team is, maybe in the U.S. you can ask somebody like, "Does everyone understand?" And people will be like, "No, I don't understand. Like, explain it again," or something like that. But if you, at least with his team, like if he's asked like, "Do you understand?" Everybody says yes. But what he ended up doing is he has to ask essentially more questions to get to the place where like pick someone out and say like can you explain it back to me and find out did they actually understand or are they just telling me they understood to please me. And you have to understand the nuances and the different communication styles to, I think, truly be as effective as possible.
Oh, super. Super. Super.
Mhm.
Great. So let's go to that rapid fire, right? Ways to let's summarize this aspect. So Sean, what are your three tips? For those founders or SaaS companies or engineering managers who are planning to hire in India, expand their teams in India.
Mhm. So I think one of the big things would be, one of the tips I would have is like talk to somebody who's actually done it before, if you haven't done it, so kind of like what that experience might be like. What are some of the tips and tricks that have worked for other people? In my experience as well, I think hiring someone who's local that understands the talent pool is really valuable and will help ease your life significantly in terms of creating hiring pipeline. And I think the last thing is just to take the time to figure out what some of these differences are in terms of communication and work style so that you know what you're signing up for and you can make adjustments on your side so that you're setting the right expectation or you're getting essentially the things that you need to get from your employees without getting frustrated because maybe they have a different style of communication.
Super, super. Good summary.
Mhm.
Anything else would you like to add on this topic, hiring from India, before we jump to AI, or anything for hiring in general?
No,
From
I don't think so.
okay, super.
Mhm.
Good. So good conversation on
Mhm.
hiring. You have extensive experience, throughout your journey. Now let's jump on AI. You have been speaking, and digging into AI a lot.
Mhm.
You guys just conducted a conference, right? And that was also on AI, if I'm not wrong. It's
Well, I've spoken at a number of conferences on
okay.
topics of AI. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So when it comes to AI in hiring, I know you have vast experience. You have seen multiple use cases of AI, but today would love to kind of learn from you. Where do you see AI's use case when it comes to hiring?
Mhm.
I just read a report from a company called Workable. They are also into hiring space. And
Mhm.
according to that report, more than 50% of hiring managers or recruiters have started relying on AI while recruiting in one form or another, knowingly or unknowingly,
Mhm.
because most of the companies are trying to leverage it. What I see is that AI is still at a very nascent stage. We are doing a lot of work in AI, but we need to be a lot more responsible and conscious while using AI into recruitment. Uh, that so-called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, would be very risky with AI. It
Mhm.
was still okay when you were, kind of building those softwares to enhance, processes. Those softwares were not very intelligent. But especially when using AI into a sensitive area like hiring, where decisions are linked to career of people, we at Applers also feel a lot of kind of sense of uh, that responsibility while we are implementing that. Uh, so despite AI is in market democratized since 2023 and people are widely using it. I see that there are two scenarios. Uh, there are many AI tools in recruitment which are not yet sophisticated enough for team to use it into hiring, finding top talent. And there are few technologies which can really help, but possibly the team members or hiring members are not yet quite sophisticated to use them because those are not engineer, right? So hey, leveraging this technology would require technology to get sophisticated and even the user to learn. And I think today probably the scenario is which is combination of both. Uh, at Applers, we think a lot about that. What are the capabilities of AI? Up to what level of transformation it can bring to hiring process. At one extreme, a situation could be that hey, you feed your job description and information to your AI engine, push a button, let AI do its magic, and presto, you got hired, right?
Yeah, someone just
Which
shows up.
shows up, right? AI works as your hiring manager, enhance your job description, push it to multiple job boards, attracts tons of application, screen and curate top application. AI can take interviews that can assess technical skills, can also be intelligent to assess behavioral aspect as per your need. And hey, it gives you a right candidate within 2 weeks. That is one extreme.
Yeah,
A long way to go.
that feels like a dystopian future.
Yeah, right. But I think when we see AI co-pilot or AI doing a lot of heavy lifting, I think a lot of imagination goes into that direction. Another case could be even in future, AI only stays as an AI co-pilot or assistant, right? It can help, make something cheaper, faster, better at some stages like say curation, evaluation stage. But still, when it comes to hiring, a lot of selection process stays on human. So this too could be extremes, and I think it would be somewhere in between. When we move forward. Uh, you have a lot of experience, right? You are seeing this world firsthand around you. What are your observations, right? Your understanding of AI, ML, the way things are shaping up. How do you see in short term and also possibly long term AI can transform hiring as a process?
Yeah, so I think AI has already been involved in the hiring process. Maybe it's not like the way we think about AI today around like generative AI systems, but certainly forms of like, uh, you know, uh, classifiers and traditional classifiers and stuff like that have been used. Even like search is a form of information retrieval is a form of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So those have all been part of hiring for a very long time, like 20 years. But I think some of the things initially I would expect uh, are already sort of happening in the industry is enhancing some of those existing workflows. So if I want to if I am a company like Google that has thousands and thousands of resumes and applications to come through, like no human can possibly do that. So they already have AI systems set up to try to figure out like who to prioritize to put in front of a person. Certainly using some of these newer techniques to understanding unstructured data is, I think, going to enhance those experiences. The other thing that I think could start to happen is bringing in more than just like the resume. So if you can take, for example, someone's resume, a lot of times they have links to maybe their GitHub and
Yep.
maybe a personal website, their LinkedIn, all these different places. then you're not only getting someone's resume and then trying to figure out, does this person have, like, is this person worth like showing to a recruiter to even like assess whether they're a good fit or not. You could actually automatically build like a dossier of that person in a profile, and then use generative AI technologies to help essentially understand the unstructured data and map that, and then use that as potentially input to a classifier that determines like the probability of this person being a fit. So I think those types of things are where we're going to see some of these initial investments, just enhancing existing workflows to be much more powerful and hopefully more accurate, so that you don't have good candidates kind of getting lost in the process. As a person looking for a job, also, I think things will get much more sophisticated, because now, what do you do as a job candidate? Maybe you go to LinkedIn, you do a search for the title of the position that you're interested in, and then you got to go through like thousands of different job postings and figure out which ones I'm interested in. Or you go to companies that maybe you're excited about or interested in, you go to the careers page, you look for something there and see like, is there something that interesting? But that's, a lot of work, a lot of manual work, and you're going to inevitably probably miss good opportunities. But if I had some sort of agentic system that could just go and do that work for me, sort of the same work that these systems are doing for recruiters, but could be going and essentially actively looking for opportunities that match my profile, my interests. So and then feeding that to me, then it becomes less of something where you're going and you're like having to actively push to find that stuff, and it becomes like something that's more passively delivering those results to you. The
Super.
other area I also think, like, one last point is sort of once someone gets into the hiring funnel and you're going through the interview process, the assessment process, all that sort of stuff, there's a lot of manual work typically involved in that as well, where I think there's opportunities for AI to help automate some of that. So less about like automating the actual experience of interviewing, but automating some of the systems of just like coordinating interviewing, coordinating assessment of people, aggregating those results,
Yeah.
coming up with recommendations. Like, I think there's huge opportunities there as well.
Yeah. Interesting. That talent operation is also big pain area for recruiters, especially. Interesting, and glad to see. I think at Applers, we are kind of working on the similar space right now, right? So we see that as of now we are able to see three use cases of AI in recruitment. One is screening, matchmaking, and the third is interviewing. Where we are building our AI recommendation engine, and as you rightly said, it is for both candidates who are applying and also for companies. And in that engine we are kind of doing matchmaking based on the job, based on other information, CV, other social profiles, or GitHubs and LinkedIn's and Stack Overflow, and we are collating all this information, and our engine is kind of matchmaking right candidates with the right company, and that matchmaking can help both the ways. It can surface right talent for the companies and right jobs for the candidate, right? Second area we are working on is an AI video assessment, which could be kind of autonomous or even a recruiter led, but where AI can ask questions, interpret answers, give some level of indications in terms of communication skills, behavior aspect, technical aspect, at a very nascent stage yet, not yet foolproof. But yeah, I think at least in a talent ecosystem like India, where you post a job and you are going to get say 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 applications, it makes life of recruiters easy. So I think
Yeah.
Plus we are deeply working into this couple of areas.
And there's been a number of companies that have tried to do some of that kind of upfront automated assessment stuff. I don't know how successful they are, but like, I think there is definitely a need for that in these places that have high volume applications. Is at least essentially is you're just sort of testing whether the person's meeting the like minimal like bar for them to have a conversation with the person.
Yeah, so I think we are keeping it just till the evaluation level, not the selection, because still human intelligence is required. And as you rightly said, AI can support into that process, but at this stage, human need to lead that. Any tools have you used in your hiring journey which are kind of AI automation led?
Not really. I mean, other than sort of the things that are already baked into existing systems, like a LinkedIn and stuff like that, or um, I think one interesting thing too that could be done, uh, but there is, of course, I think some challenges just from a privacy perspective is um, if you could actually record interviews and then assess those interviews, like, so it's kind of going back to like some of the things that we were talking about earlier, like learning from what led to good hires versus bad hires. If
Hmm.
you could actually, rather than just relying on like the raw notes, if you actually had the interviews and then you applied Gen AI technology to that to figure out, pull out themes, just like you do with sales. Like,
Hmm.
if you're recording calls on Gong, there's a lot of analysis that goes into reviewing those sales calls and pulling data out of them to figure out how do I, get someone down the funnel. I think interviews is very similar. It's like, how do I make sure that I'm, properly assessing people and everybody's doing that in a consistent way? And then how do I figure out, what leads to successful hires versus, unsuccessful hires?
Super. Very
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And the same application on the other side, right? Hey, as a talent, how
Mm-hmm.
was my last interview? What are my key learnings? Because I also need to analyze those and make my next interview better than the last one.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, because I think, as a one of the things I always recommend for Canada, especially when you're applying to engineering positions where you know that they're going to kind of do some sort of skill test, is do some shadow interviews, like do some practice interviews with people, and there's even companies that will help you, let you do this in like double blind situations and stuff, and that's a way to essentially test your skill as an interviewee.
mhm.
But if you could have that as you are actually interviewing with companies, that could be interesting too.
Oh, super, super, super. Interesting, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think this is an area where we are passionate about, and we are seeing kind of 70% correlation where AI is able to kind of make the similar decision like human when it comes to hiring, but it is still 70%, right? The bar has to go quite higher.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Interesting. Anything else, Sean, when it comes to AI in recruitment, would you like to share across?
No, I mean, I think I don't have any additional thoughts in terms of like where I think AI will impact recruitment, but I think just like almost all like industries and verticals, like AI is going to have probably a pretty dramatic impact on them over the next 5 years.
Hmm. Hmm. Super, super, great.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's cover some aspects for even hiring at Skyflow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I saw many open positions in Skyflow LinkedIn. Few of them are from India. Any top two three tips you want to share with the talents who are looking to join Skyflow?
Yeah, so I mean, we touched on some of these things earlier, just in generality. But I think one of the big things as a candidate that we are always looking at is like, you need to do your research, like really understand like why you're joining, and have a essentially good story for why you're interested in Skyflow specifically. So a lot of times when I think you ask people like why you're interested in Skyflow, you might get like generic sort of responses of like, oh, like I'm really interested in joining a high growth like stage startup, and that's great, but like that can also apply to like 100,000 companies basically. So like, what is it that uniquely is the unique reason why you want to be at Skyflow? And I would say in general, even outside of Skyflow, any company that you're applying for, especially a startup, like you need to understand like why uniquely that company is interesting to you.
Hmm.
And I think one of the other things, especially in hiring for senior positions, is you can't be afraid to take some chances in the interview process. Like, we think of ourselves as we want to build like an exceptional company, and to do that, you need exceptional talent. So you have to figure out, how do I show that I'm exceptional during the interview process, and you can't do that if you're like completely risk averse and kind of giving generic answers. You need to be willing to kind of have a perspective, have a point of view, and sometimes it's okay to have a you know a contrasting point of view, or even a point of view that is maybe wrong based on the information that you have available, but at least have a point of view, have an opinion in some sense, right? and you can deliver that across in different ways. Like you don't have to be like antagonistic or a jerk about it, but you can essentially say like, hey, like based on the information I have, and I realize that might be limited information, but if I was in the position, I would I think this would be a good idea. um, and then last thing, and this is kind of a general thing in terms of just interview prep for anybody, is when it comes to getting ready for sort of behavioral style interviews, you really need to prep your best stories and don't be afraid to go into detail. Because usually, what interviewers are trying to do is test how much you care about that thing and how much of it did you actually own. So that's your opportunity to kind of showcase, like, I really understand this thing, I really cared about it, and I know the details of it.
Interesting, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So good summary. Your 3 points are: hey, be very clear why you want to join a company, whether Skyflow or anything. That passion is required to join any startup, right? Second is be very open. Share your opinion. There is no harm, you know, kind of sharing or expressing your risk appetite there. And third is bring your stories, deeper stories, because that's what that your passion would be gauged based upon. Interesting,
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Great. Super interesting, Sean. Now, it has been a great conversation. We are almost there in terms of our time. Shall we go for a couple of more rapid fire?
Sure, we'll do a couple of rapid fire. Let's do
Okay,
it.
great. So, Sean, which are the three SaaS products that you are really excited about? You feel they will make it big.
Mm-hmm. Besides Skyflow,
One is Skype.
the yeah,
Second is Uploads. Yeah. I think only one left.
yeah. Uh, so I was thinking about this a bit. I think maybe I'm biased by this because I was at their office last night, but like Airbyte, I really like as a company,
Mhm.
uh, and Kong as well. And I think, and even though they're completely different products, I think they have sort of a similar thing where they're both like really modern takes on existing problems. So Airbyte sort of focused on data ingestion
Mhm.
at scale, and Kong focused on interconnecting APIs, API gateways, and stuff like that. And Kong did like 100 million in revenue last year, which is crazy for the stage that they're at. So they seem to be like on crazy trajectories. And then there's a newer company. I talked to their founders a while back in like a podcast interview, but Unstructured, which and there's a few of these companies in the space, but I think there's this huge opportunity right now, both around like LLM ops, so sort of building developer tooling for building generative AI experiences. But there's also a big opportunity around sort of ETL for unstructured data because of generative AI. It's really the first time in our history where we have an opportunity to really tap into unstructured data. And I think Unstructured, that company, is doing a really great job, and it has an interesting take on it.
Oh, super interesting, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, even startups are taking up complex problems in the industry, right, and solving it with innovation and drive.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, second question, right? Which are the three books that you would recommend every product leader should read while they are going through the journey you had before few years?
Um, yeah, so there's a few different things. So I think I always like this book Range by David Epstein, which talks
Mhm.
about how generalists will thrive in a over specialized world. So it kind of goes through how over the years we've started to over specialize too early, and it really makes a case for how you need to start as a generalist and then specialize, and that helps you be like a better problem solver.
Mhm.
There's a really good book by about this guy Bill Campbell by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, and a couple other authors as well. I can't remember the names of them, but it's called Trillion Dollar Coach. And it's about
Mhm.
this guy Bill Campbell, who's the coach for a lot of like really famous people that have led really big companies
Yeah.
in Silicon Valley. And he's like a former football coach, and it talks about like his approach to coaching and the things that they deliver to them.
I'm reading.
Um, and then I think last one, just from general startups, is like Ben Horowitz's like Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is his story of like essentially founding and taking a company public. and all the hard things that they had to go through and the hard decisions. As some, if you're interested in founding a company, like it's a great sort of story in terms of someone who's been through it and lived through it and saw success along while going through all those hard things.
Yep, yep. So two of those books I already have in my library. Range I'll order straight away after the podcast. Great. Awesome. Awesome. Great conversation. Anything else, Sean, you want to add before we close? Any closing remarks?
No, I mean, I think if I guess like we are hiring at Skyflow, so if you enjoyed this conversation and you're on the market and interested, check us out at skyflow.com, and you can go to the careers page and see the various roles that we're hiring for. And just like I said, in terms of hiring managers, always working on pipeline. As a candidate, you should also be doing those things. So even if we don't have a role for you, feel free to reach out if you're interested in the company, and you'll be on our radar for future hiring.
Oh, super, super, super. Yes, Jim. So apply to Skyflow. Look at Sean. He has amazing experience. The founders, they are amazing chaps. So it's a company worth applying for. They are hiring for remote roles. So which most of the talents in India look up for. So yeah, I think great conversation, Sean. Great conversation. We have touched on multiple aspects and very diverse aspects, right? Hiring and AI and your journey and hiring in India has been a great conversation. You have been a great guest. The conversation has been super easy with you.
Great. Well, nice to hear it. Have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
Bye.